Hey everybody, welcome to episode 3 of RETRY Season 2. Today we're going to be looking at one of my personal favorites, Pac-Man on the Atari 2600, released in 1982 by Atari. Before we take a look at the 2600 version of Pac-Man, you've got to glance at the original, released in 1980 by Namco for the arcades. It's beautiful, and it is a piece of video gaming legend. After 31 years, Pac-Man is still just as recognizable and as famous as he ever was. Before Mario, before Sonic, Pac-Man was the most recognizable crossover video game success. Everybody recognized him, even if you didn't like video games. The Maze Chase arcade game even became a successful genre, all because of Pac-Man's initial success. So how did we get from this to this? Atari had received exclusive rights to create home versions of Namco's arcade games. It made perfect sense after the breakout success of Pac-Man in the arcades that they would immediately develop it for the 2600. The president of Atari at the time was Ray Kassar, and he was determined to have Pac-Man for the 2600 available for sale by Christmas 1981. Development on the Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man only took 5 months start to finish. Todd Fry was given the task of programming this game in such a short time frame, and he did so, completing all the programming within 6 weeks. On top of having to deal with the time constraints, Mr. Fry also had to deal with the smaller cartridge size. That's right, even though the 8K memory cartridge was available at the time through Atari, they wanted him to program the game on a 4K cartridge because it would be cheaper to produce. That's why the ghosts flicker. You can't even show all 4 ghosts on the screen at the same time because the memory wasn't big enough to allow it. So during this game's development, Todd Fry did something that nobody saw coming. He went to the president of Atari and said, "You know what? I want a percentage of each cartridge made. And if you don't give it to me, I'm gonna go to Activision and leave you with an unfinished game." So Atari was like, "Oh crap, we can't lose this guy. So we'll pay him 10 cents for every cartridge made." Which, you know what? They made 12 million copies of this game. You see, Atari thought that every single person that had ever bought a system, basically like 9 or 10 million people out there, were going to buy Pac-Man because of how popular it was in the arcades. And on top of that, they were planning on 2 million more people buying an Atari 2600 just to play this game. I'll tell you, as a kid, I loved this game. I don't care what anybody says. None of my friends expected it to be as good as the arcade version of the game. We just wanted something to play when we couldn't get a chance to go out to the mall and put our quarters into the machine. And a lot of other people felt the exact same way. They sold 7 million copies of Pac-Man on the Atari 2600. It's the #1 selling 2600 game of all time. The gameplay couldn't be simpler. You move around the map eating all the pellets. If you eat a power pellet, the ghosts will have to run away from you and you can eat them, and they'll have to flee for a short period of time. And when the whole map is clear, you get to move on to the next one. I can't believe I'm actually explaining the gameplay of Pac-Man. I never thought I'd actually do it, so I'm gonna stop now. If you don't know Pac-Man by now, you can always have a 5-year-old explain it to you. Watch this.
Grandpa, you wanna play Pac-Man?
Pac-Man? Pull or see?
I'll show you, Grandpa.
Pac-Man is a video game cartridge you have to buy separately to play on the Atari video computer system. Your parents hook it up to the TV.
Those are supposed to be the ghosts after Pac-Man. Watch out, Grandpa. Stick with me. You'll get the hang of it.
This is the Atari video computer system. Pac-Man and other video game cartridges are each sold separately.
Atari introduces the woman of the year, Ms. Pac-Man. With a style of entertainment that Pac-Man never knew, an endless supply of floating goodies, oranges, pretzels, 4 different screens, each with different exits and entrances, and the green screen so difficult to reach, you may never see it again.
Don't you know I'm more than Pac-Man with a bow?
Reach for Ms. Pac-Man.
Reach for Atari.
Atari was headed into 1982 with control of the biggest video game franchise that the world had seen up to that point, Pac-Man. There's just one problem. Even though Pac-Man was their best-selling game of all time, they had so overshot sales projections that they were left with millions of copies that they had to buy back from various department stores who couldn't sell them. And that wasn't their only mistake. Atari had bought the rights to make E.T., Steven Spielberg's masterpiece, into a video game for the 2600. They paid $22 million for the rights to do so. To put that number in perspective, the E.T. movie only cost $10.5 million to make, and Atari paid more than double that just to make the video game. Then, to make matters worse, in 1982, Atari unsuccessfully sued Activision for publishing control for Atari 2600 games. Once Atari lost that court case, that meant any individual third-party developer could make a game for the 2600. Tons of companies sprung up overnight, releasing horrible games for the 2600, just trying to cash in on Atari's success. By late 1982, Atari was facing competition on all sides, from console systems and even new release computer systems. For example, the Commodore 64 had better graphics, better sound, and a much broader selection of software, not just games, word processors, accounting tools, things that the whole family could use. Mom? Alright everybody, it's time to sit back, relax, and enjoy my horrible gameplay. It's time for the big fail. All of my deaths in Pac-Man fall under two separate categories. Number one, I get too greedy. The second way I die can only be referred to as pulling a Tony. This phenomenon is when a video game player appears to know exactly what they're doing. Then out of nowhere they do something so catastrophically stupid, it has to be shared. The entire video game industry began to crash and burn. By the middle of 1983, people had stopped trying to release good quality developed titles and just rushed anything to market that they could to make a quick buck. But most of the companies that had sprung up to become third-party developers for the Atari 2600 and other systems, they were folding left and right. Big companies like Magnavox and Coleco just abandoned the video game market altogether. How bad was the video game crash of 1983? It took 2 years for the industry to bounce back. The crash was so bad that many economists believed that video games were no more than a passing fad, and they might be a small dollar niche item in the future, but they would never reach the glory that they had reached before. The final point I want to make is that Pac-Man for the Atari 2600 has an interesting place in history in being part of this large picture of the video game crash. It's not solely responsible, but you have to understand and respect its place in this crazy time. One of the reasons why I still love Pac-Man for the 2600 so much is when I look at it, I can see the history surrounding it. It's just as important a title as Super Mario Bros. So if you're looking to play your own piece of history and you want to pick up Pac-Man on the 2600, you're in luck. There were 5 million unsold copies, so I assure you, if you have a secondhand store that sells any Atari 2600 games, they'll have Pac-Man and it'll probably be less than $1.
Hey, where'd my awesome 80s music go? Oh yeah, that's definitely more like it. Now it's time for the answers no one should have asked for. It's 2 horrible questions with Tony B. Let's see what we got first up. We have Sheila from Santa Claus, Indiana, who asks, what was Pac-Man's real name and why did they change it? Sheila, that is not following the rules. That is 2 separate questions, and oh God, there's always someone from Indiana that has to screw everything up. Look, you know what? I can't answer one without the other. So originally, when Namco released Pac-Man to the arcades, he was called Puck-Man. Yeah, cute little name, but when Midway was bringing Puck-Man over to the States, they were worried that the arcade cabinets would be vandalized to read, okay, children look away, adults only, are you ready? Yeah. I'd say it was pretty smart to change the name, right? Alrighty. What do we have next? Our second question. Looks like it comes from Bucky in Intercourse, Alabama. Really? Really? Intercourse, Alabama. Bucky, remember, in the Deep South, it's better to give than receive. His question is, Tony B, at what point does merchandising go too far? Well, that's actually a pretty good question, Bucky. How about you watch this? I think it will explain it.
Oh, Pac-Man, I'm beat.
And I'm hungry.
Thank goodness for new Pac-Man pasta from Chef Boyardee.
New Pac-Man pasta? Little spaghetti shaped like us. Delicious.
And because Chef Boyardee's packed with goodness, it's great for when we have to eat and run.
New Pac-Man pasta from Chef Boyardee. With meatballs, without meatballs, or chicken flavor.
Thank goodness for new Pac-Man pasta. Thank goodness for Chef Boyardee.
You know what, Bucky? I think about the time that you're putting Pac-Man's meatballs in your mouth, everything has gone too far. Kneel before Zod, son of Jor-El. Pac-Man for the 2600 was Atari's high water mark. It was their best-selling game of all time, yet it heralded in the worst period in video game history as well, the video game crash in 1983. Now, in 1996, Atari forever removed themselves from making consoles after the failure of the Atari Jaguar to capture a sizable portion of the video game console market. So they turned all their attention from that point on to making software. But you know what? After 3 decades, Pac-Man still lives on.
Thanks for watching. For VideoGameSaga.com, this is Tony B, and I'm out. Retry? You know it.